Okay, I'm recording now. So it says section 1, free response question. This is from chapter 1, question number 12. You are interested in how much time students spend on the internet each day. Here are the data on the time you spent on the internet in minutes for a particular day, reported by a random sample of 30 students at a large high school. So I enter those values into my calculator. I'm not going to do that in the video, but I enter them one at a time, and I have 3 ways to check. Okay, the 2 ways on a test. On a test, there are 30 values, so on my computer I should have 30 to make sure I didn't skip any. I enter them from top to bottom, and I check from bottom to top to double check, and then I entered the correct values. A third way, and this would not be on a test, but when you're working in class or with a partner, you would calculate the one variable statistics, and you would compare your mean and your standard deviation. If those two are equivalent to your partner, then you guys both have the same data in your calculator and potentially have not made a mistake. The first question is to construct a histogram of this data. So the first thing I do is construct a histogram. There it is. There's the automatic histogram that is created by just creating a new page and then creating a histogram. That is not what I copy down. I alter, I play around with the bins, and I changed the bin size to 20. These are 20. And I auto zoomed to get an accurate description of my histogram, and it seems like a reasonable sized bin size and a reasonable distribution. It is slightly skewed to the right, and I could create a larger bin size because I see a gap there, but I'm not going to force to get rid of my gaps. This is a good histogram. It just happens to have a gap. So immediately the gap itself leads me to say that the median and the IQR are better measure of center and spread. Just the gap itself. Okay? But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and calculate the standard deviations. So I know what the mean and the standard deviation are. That was calculated earlier. It's 54.7 and 32.6. I multiply the standard deviation by 2, and I add it to the mean, and I subtract it to the mean. I get 120, and I get negative 10. Now, earlier I had said 3, but there's this gray area between 2 and 3. So, in this particular problem, I know that there's an outlier. How do I know that? Well, I'm going to go back over here. Even though I was not told to create a box plot, it doesn't take but 2 seconds to create a box plot. That doesn't mean I'm going to draw it on the paper, but I want to know. I want to know whether there's an outlier or not before I even do anything. Is there an outlier by looking at this box plot? Yes, there is. It's right there. The calculator tells you. Is that enough evidence to prove on the test? No, it's not. Okay, so this is not about evidence. This is about you knowing whether there's an outlier or not, and there is. So I go back to my note page here. There is an outlier. But what happens if I multiply it by 3 like we had said earlier? I'm going to multiply it by 3. And I'm going to multiply this one by 3. I get 152. The highest number is 151. 3 standard deviations. There is no value beyond 3 standard deviations. So according to that rule, there is no outlier. But that's a gray area. The only really solid rule for outliers is the IQR. That 1.5 times the IQR, there is no question about that rule. Okay? So let me go down and I calculate the IQR, which is 47. 1.5 times 47 is 70.5. I add that to my Q3 and I subtract it from my Q1, and that gives me my boundaries, and there is clearly an outlier where the boundary is 147 and there's 151 there's a point at 151, so there clearly is an outlier. So whether I use 2 standard deviations or whether I use the IQR, either way, the result is the evidence shows that there's an outlier at 151. So I answer the question, would it be better to use the mean and standard deviation for the median, or the median and the IQR to describe the center and spread for this distribution? The best measure of central tendency and spread is the median which equals to 46.5, and the IQR, a measure of spread, is 47. So in the best measure of spread, the best measure of spread is the IQR, because there's an outlier at 151. If it doesn't ask to describe the distribution, don't do it. In this particular problem, it did not ask us to describe it. So you shouldn't do it if you're not asked. But let's go over it anyways. Why? You're not going to get any extra credit for answering questions that weren't asked from me or from the AP exam. IQR is the median, and the best. Okay, got it. And the best measure of spread is IQR 47. Okay, so like 2 sentences is what you're saying.
So we don't have to do SOX if it doesn't ask for it?
If it does not ask to describe the distribution, don't. Sometimes you're asked a different question, and that question really requires you to do SOX. So you have to be intuitive. You have to know, wow, the answer to this question really requires me to describe the distribution, and that will lead me to the answer, right? So I'm not saying, it didn't say to do SOX, don't do SOX. If you don't need to do SOX, don't do SOX. If they don't ask you to do SOX and you don't need it, don't do it. But if they ask you a different question, which requires you to know SOX, then do SOX. Okay, but I'm just going to go over this one just so that we know what is the distribution of the time a student spent on the internet each day. Is unimodal and skewed to the right slightly. All right, there's an outlier at 151 and a gap at, let's see, where's the gap? The gap at between and 100 and 120, and a gap between 100 and 120. The typical time for a student spends on the internet is 46.5 minutes. The range is 144 minutes, which is from 7 minutes to 151. The IQR is 47 minutes. Done.